Hi, I've just finished, and not for the first time, Alexandre Dumas as the Three Musketeers. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong. I misspelt it already wrong once. So not for the first time have I read this book, but this actual novel for the first time, I bought myself a treat. It's nicely bound in leather, and it's got pretty insides, and it's got quotes all over the cover embossed. I'm actually really pleased with this volume. I think probably one of my favorite quotes on this is, "When I'm insulted, I do not faint, I avenge myself." The fact that it was a quote of the villain is irregardless, it's a great quote. So this particular copy is described as having been translated by Anonymous, as many of Dumas's work when it was translated into English was. It's a beautiful translation. The language dances off the page. It is so much fun to read. Now, I think all of Dumas is, but anyway, I think it's epic fiction, more epic than most fantasy you get out there these days. It is got swashbuckling. It's a weird word, swashbuckling. I've always wondered about it. But anyway, there's definitely swash and buckling and swords. So swashbuckling, adventures, people riding all over the place, amazing friendships that we all want to have and most of us never do. There's politics, there's deceitful and yet beautiful women, there's horrible events, there's wonderful events. It's got a rich gamut of enjoyment of the human spectrum. Wonderful stuff. Every bit of the 600 and something pages of this is wonderful. Now, it's kind of the prototype of swords and sorcery when you think about it. Just about everything that you get in a really, really good swords and sorcery book is in this book, except maybe the sorcery. And even that I feel is open for debate, because if you've read this book, right at the end there, a lot of what happens with Countess de Winter feels kind of sorcery-ish. Apparently she just talks to a man, he falls at her feet and does ridiculous things. Anyway, on to classic literature. I have always loved Dumas. As a teenager, I wanted to like classic literature, but I couldn't always enjoy it. So I had to grow into the enjoyment of a lot of the classic literature. Hardy, Dickens, the Brontes, none of those came naturally to me. I had to learn to appreciate the story and the writing before I could actually enjoy the book. Dumas, however, was different. Dumas and Kipling were two that the second I read it, I automatically loved it. I feel that the words of everything that Dumas has ever written just dance off the page and straight into my brain. It's a wonderful experience. Now, because Dumas is very much a favorite author and also very much a non-renewable resource, I don't let myself read too much of him. I will read a book every now and then. I think last year or the year before I read The Count of Monte Cristo. This time I came back to the Three Musketeers. With Dumas, as well as the writing being love at first paragraph for me, my favourite is always the one that I am reading at the moment or I've just read. So right now The Three Musketeers is my favourite, but it's always one of my favourites. I also really enjoyed some of the movie versions. There was one in the early 90s that was especially wonderful. But yes, so I don't read the copies that I own too often. Nevertheless, when I went to pick up the Three Musketeers off my shelf, I realised that the last copy that I had, which was one of the classic copies, had too hard a life. Its spine had been separated from the pages in 3 places, and the last time I went to pick it up, some of the pages were missing, so I'd gotten rid of it. Sadly, I probably wept. That, however, was perfect justification for me to treat myself to this gorgeous copy, which I'm really loving. Feels lovely. Sort of. Sorry. Sorry, not sorry. So, the writing is so flowing and so humorous, and it is chock-a-block full of satire. there's the normal type humor, but there's strange humor. Now, I know that a lot of people say that Dumas was actually a populist writer. He wrote for magazines and periodicals. It wasn't considered true literature in his own day. But he certainly managed to pack in a lot of political commentary as well as social commentary and a lot of commentary on humanity. At times when he's talking about his main protagonist, Artigan, and especially I feel with, well, actually all of them, but Aramis and I think most of all Athos, you feel that he is satirizing everything that you feel that you know about humanity. And he makes ludicrous statements about what's good and bad when the thing that he is praising is quite obviously not good. So I think there's a lot more to Dumas than some people realize. And it's totally worth reading it for yourself and finding out. There's no sugary ethics. There's no standardized, stereotypical behavior. There is nothing really that isn't creative about this book. I particularly owed myself some Dumas because I had just finished Game of Thrones. All 1036 minutes of grim, dark, monotonous, very average, in my personal opinion, writing style with a intensely uncreative and largely uninteresting story with stereotypical characters that never emerged as real people. So Dumas is as far from that as you can get, and I needed that. In terms of historical pacing, yeah, let's talk about the pacing of the novel. So, huge, thick novel. We start with our main hero, D'Artigan. I think it's a silent D and I'm probably mispronouncing it. Artigan, possibly. He comes from an area of France called Gascon. All I know about the Gascon really is that it produces really marvellous red wines. So all the regions in France that are referred to here kind of slide over my head with a big whoosh, but that's fine. You don't really need that. You don't really need to know the history of France terribly much to follow this as well. I did read up a little bit on King Louis the whatever and Anne of Austria, his queen, and the cardinal after reading this. I'm not any much more enlightened. I don't know that much about French history. So we start off with D'Artigan, who's leaving his native Gascony. He's got a letter of introduction to the head of the Musketeers. I'm not going to pronounce the name of the head of the Musketeers. It begins with T. I'm sure I would mispronounce it. So on the way, D'Artigan meets with a misfortune. He enters into a duel with a man who steals his letter of introduction. He then comes to the city. He can't get into the Musketeers at first. He has to join a member of the guards, but it follows his friendship with three of the Musketeers. Now, why is it called Three Musketeers when there's essentially four of them? But it's really D'Artigan and the Three Musketeers, and if at the end of it there's four Musketeers, which there are, it's still the Three Musketeers are separate. The way he meets them is by insulting each one of them in turn and organising duels with each one of them an hour a pace. This is wonderful writing. It's fun. It's been in every single one of the movies because it's too good a story not to tell over and over again. Basically, he meets in one place to fight the first of the Musketeers, who brings the other two, his mates, as his backup, and they turn up and they go, "Hey, I'm fighting you too." And he goes, but only in an hour's time. And then the other one turns up and is like, "Hey, I'm fighting you too, but in 2 hours' time." It's a great bit of storytelling. And it's a great way to introduce D'Artigan, or Artigan, and each of the Musketeers. So you get a little bit of background on each one of these Musketeers, what they look like, what their general demeanour is, and each one of them is quite unique and distinct from the others. After all of them have been introduced, you embark in the first adventure, and that also is the one that I think most people springs to mind the most associated with the Three Musketeers, and I think it's been every single one of the televised versions. It's a great story. King Louis has gifted his wife with these diamond cuffs on a blue ribbon. He mistrusts her because he knows that she has an admirer across the channel in England, the Duke of Buckingham. And she indiscreetly and secretly gives 2 of the diamond cuffs to her admirer, Duke of Buckingham. The Cardinal, who is the main... He's not really a villain, he's kind of the anti-hero. He's on the side of France, but he wants to control it his way. He's always controlling the king, who in this book is depicted as being rather foolish and childlike. Whether he was in real life, I'm not sure about that, but in this book he is. And the Cardinal also has a complete dislike for the Queen, and he's always trying to drive stakes between the King and the Queen. So the Queen has given these 2 diamond cuffs, and they've gone across to England. The Cardinal learns of it. He talks the King into giving a fair and forcing his Queen to wear the diamond cuff. And the Cardinal plans at the last minute to bring out the 2 that have been sent away and go, aha, she's cheating on you with Buckingham. The 3 Musketeers are employed on behalf of the Queen and the King, because they're the King's Musketeers. And they do this daring trip to England to retrieve the cuff, so that when the ball comes around, the King comes and waves 2 diamond cuffs at her. And she goes, oh, you're giving me 2 more, now I'll have 14. And so the Cardinal is defeated, and he's a bit unhappy about that. And the King and the Queen are supreme, and the 3 Musketeers win. It's great, and I think everyone knows that particular one. Now, after that first adventure, Dumas backtracks a little bit. We get to learn about the 4 servants. Each musketeer and D'Artagnan have a servant who's as much part of the plot as the main characters. We learn a bit about them, and at this point we get more of an evolution and a development of the characters of the Musketeers. D'Artagnan we already have, but the Musketeers keep on being developed throughout, so they become more and more real. Though throughout the book, I think the character of Athos gets more and more supremacy. The other ones maybe not quite so much. Having completed the first adventure, we then go into the romantic adventures of each of the Musketeers. D'Artagnan falls in love with a young woman who happens to be the wife of his landlord, which is unfortunate, but she's in the service of the Queen, so she isn't actually in the house, and that's their link into the Queen, who they continue to serve in against the Cardinal's attempts to discredit her. And it's a very rolling sort of story. The narrative goes from one thing to another, and it's actually the beauty of the writing that sustains you through this really long book, rather than the actual adventures. However, I'm going to say that in the second half of a book, you get a bit more of a different story arc. So, right in the beginning, when D'Artagnan is heading to Paris, and his letters stolen from him by a man with a scar on his face. The man with the scar on his face is meeting Milady in a carriage, and it becomes clear that both the man and Milady are instruments of the Cardinal against the King and the Queen. Those characters roll throughout the book, and different experiences happen between them and the main protagonists. But the last part of the book, they become supreme in that it's all about Milady, who becomes the main villain. She's a villain throughout, but at the end she becomes the main focus. And what happens to her at the end, very satisfying ending, very happy making ending. You can't put it down for the last, 50 pages. What happens to her at the end is the culmination of the book. And like most people, and a lot of the people who filmed it, I think I like the first bit better than the last bit. There's a point where Milady is captive of the Duke de Winter, who is her brother, or what we'd call brother-in-law. And at that point, Milady becomes almost farcically villainesque. She is the villain, she's a terrible person, no doubt about that. She's horrible, cruel, self-centered, does nasty things to people for no particularly good reason, except she feels like it. But in captivity, that's when sword and sorcery comes in, because she's depicted as this seductress who with just a few conversations with a person can totally turn around his character and make him do things that he wouldn't otherwise do. I get that that's a good narrative plot, and it probably appealed to people more in the 1844s than it does in the 2020s. But Countess de Winter's ability to talk someone into becoming crazy for her and doing crazy things, that's practically sorcery. It doesn't make any sense. It's not believable in any particular way. So, bringing back epic fantasy, historical fiction, or even better, fiction written historically, and sword and sorcery. Totally recommend it. If you aren't terribly into classics, I think the Three Musketeers might be the classic literature for you. If you like epic fantasy, it's better than a lot of it, and the writing is spectacularly beautiful. I'm not going to start to quote from it, because I could probably quote from every single page in that book something beautiful. It's just amazing writing. So, I've raved about that enough. It was a beautiful palate freshener after that last book, which was so long and so boring. There is not one actual paragraph in this book that is anything but beautiful. None of it was boring. Loved every second of it. If you think that 600 odd pages of novel is too much for you, maybe just go back and watch the movie from the early 90s, which was marvellous. That was really good. Now I want to watch that movie again. So if you've read Dumas, comment, tell me the ones I haven't read. I'm pretty sure I have read them, but people love telling you to read the ones that you've already read. If you comment and subscribe and all that sort of stuff, YouTube likes it, so make YouTube happy. But comment, that makes me happy.